the BRI is a project which is a complex project to describe in terms of success, largely because after BRI started with President Xi Jinping's announcements in Jakarta and in Kazakhstan, it seems that the scope of BRI continued to widen. And in fact, every cooperative project or Chinese foreign aid project and even investment project by Chinese companies, state-owned companies, sort of fell within the scope of BRI. And that's why it's very difficult to really say how successful BRI has been. In fact, there was an American scholar, Scott Kennedy, who once said that BRI is like a Christmas tree. You can hang anything on it, any policy goals on it. And that's why I think it's difficult to determine the success of BRI. But judging by anecdotal evidence, it seems that it has clearly not achieved the objectives of BRI, particularly the objectives as they were set out in the first BRI document that was released by the National Development and Reform Commission in 2014, almost a year, more than a year, in fact, after first President Xi Jinping announced the BRI. So overall, I think it has created a large number of projects. There are, projects ranging from power plants, roads and bridges and tunnels. But on the whole, it's very difficult to see how the BRI has succeeded in the original objective. And when I say original objective, the original objective, although not clearly stated by the Chinese government, the original objective was that BRI will integrate China with the economies of Eurasia. So Eurasia and China will become very closely integrated, and it will increase the interdependence of countries ranging from Asia to Africa, Middle East, all the way to Europe. And I don't think that has happened. In fact, the opposite seemed to be happening over the last few years, where there's been a pushback against Chinese policy from, particularly from the West, from the European countries. Italy, which had become the first G7 country to join the BRI, has now withdrawn from the BRI. So overall, I think the success of BRI has not been tremendous. I don't think this would be considered, in history, in the long-term literature, as a great success for China. I think it's been very challenging. I think there wasn't much detailed thought that went into the Belt and Road Initiative, because when President Xi Jinping announced it in Kazakhstan and Jakarta in 2013, really not a great deal of work had gone into the BRI. BRI was almost like the Chinese economic reforms of the late 1970s. Economic reforms of the late 1970s had no blueprint. And similarly, the BRI announcement in 2013 did not have a blueprint. And it was not until a year after, in fact, in 2015, that the Chinese National Development Reform Commission published its first document, about 30-something pages, on the BRI. And therefore, the lack of proper planning in terms of what BRI was supposed to achieve, and also very poor risk management, because when the Chinese leadership announced the BRI, or the One Belt, One Road, as it was originally called, all of the Chinese government machinery, all ministries, provincial governments, and state-owned enterprises, they all became involved in this project. And they all threw themselves into it. They were competing with each other to try to prove that they were sincerely participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is not surprising, because in the Chinese system, once the top leadership makes an announcement, everybody tries to compete with each other to show their loyalty, to show that they are actually supporting the top leadership's initiative. And the same thing happened with BRI. Many Chinese companies, many Chinese development banks and other financial institutions invested money or loaned money to to countries who were participating in the BRI without proper risk assessment. And you've seen that in Sri Lanka, for example, projects were supported without proper risk assessment, which later on, proved to be financially not viable. So poor risk management, poor planning, I think, have been the major reasons for the lack of relative success of the BRI. I think for the recipient countries, provided, and assuming that China is willing to continue to extend the BRI, for the many developing countries who willingly participated in the Belt and Road Initiative, including in South Asia, for these countries, if China is willing to continue to lend money and work with the governments of these countries to support the infrastructure projects that they need, rather than what one individual leader or what the Chinese government may want, then I think it can be leveraged by developing countries for their own economic development. But when we're talking about leverage, of course, leverage, the Chinese government would also leverage it, but developing countries have their own agency, and they would try to leverage it for their economic development. So I think in terms of how the BRI projects or BRI funding can be leveraged by developing countries, I think the quality of recipient countries will be, in the host country, in other words, will be important, which are well-governed, where leadership is aware of and borrowing money from other countries, including from China. I think those countries would do well, provided China is willing to continue to support BRI projects. But for China itself, I think leveraging BRI for China's geopolitical or geoeconomic advantages, I think BRI has become far too controversial to yield any significant geopolitical advantages to China.